Yeah. Yeah, you can start.
Okay. So I welcome our guest and speaker, Professor Saugata Bhaduri, our principal, Professor Masroor Ahmed Beg, all the teachers of the Department of English at ZHDC, and all the teachers and students from our university and from other universities who would be joining today. We've now been having a series of lectures for all the participants in the Literary Society for more than a year. This is the second lecture series in lectures opening this year with Professor Bhaduri speaking. And apart from the lectures, the English Literary Society of our college has literary meetings and discussions, film screenings, uh, and an annual literary festival somewhere around February, March. Um, the talk today is on language, subject, and alterity. The questions of language and the subject, the self and the other in its various manifestations, have been central in so many ways to the curriculum of English literature across semesters. When we as teachers at times talk to the students about the complexities of language, of interiority, or of the writer or poet's constant struggles with the system of language to articulate the self, we often feel the need of a framework that would support or clarify our discussions. It is with this intention towards such clarity on these matters that I requested Professor Bhaduri to throw some light on these issues, especially keeping our fresh young audience in mind. And I'm thankful to him that he readily accepted our request and suggested this topic. I now request our teacher in charge, Dr. Madhumita, to introduce her to the audience so that we might begin the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Anas. And I once again take the opportunity to welcome Professor Saugata Bhaduri, Bhaduri Da to many of us, to our college once again. He's been here before, of course, in the physical format, and we would like to have him back in the physical mode, maybe in the next sometime again in the next few months. So thank you and welcome to the college. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you in front of our audience. Saugata Bhaduri teaches at the Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has served as the visiting professor at many universities and colleges in Europe, UK, and the USA, and has been the recipient of several international research grants and awards. His areas of research interest include the cultural history of colonial Bengal, literary and cultural theory, popular culture and translation, and comparative literature studies. His latest books are Polycoloniality, European Transactions with Bengal from the 13th to the 19th Century, Bloomsbury 2020, and the forthcoming A Critical History of Bengali Literature, Orion Black Swan. His earlier books include Transcultural Negotiations of Gender, Studies in B. Longate, published by Springer in 2015, Literary Theory and Introductory Reader, published by Anthem in 2010, Perspectives on Comparative Literature and Culture in the Age of Globalization, again Anthem 2010, Negotiating Localization, Anthem 28, and Translating Power, Katha 2008. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg of his works, his publications, and his research interests. And we look forward to hearing him once again. So without any further ado, I would hand over to Professor Bhaduri.
Thank you so much, Madhumita and Anas and everyone else for asking me to deliver this talk. It is indeed always a pleasure to talk to the students and faculty members of Zakir Hussain Delhi College evening. And as Madhumita said, of course, it will be my great pleasure to once again be able to come to the college physically rather than only through this via media mode of communication through electronic means. But that being said, let me begin. Let me also thank Anas for practically giving me this topic, because as Anas himself also said in his brief introductory comment, that he felt that maybe the students of your department need to be talked to about the connection between language and subjectivity and alterity. So he practically told me what to speak on. And I'm sure that what I will say very, very introductorily, because this talk is primarily aimed to undergraduate students of a college, very introductorily, I'll be able to do justice within the next 40-45 minutes or so to this very complex topic. So we all deal with language because the audience that I am speaking to today primarily comprises students and teachers of literature, of language and literature. So we deal with language all the time. That is what we do. That is what we are supposed to handle academically. But what does language itself do? I mean, that seems to be the primary question. Language obviously is a means of communication, and communicating primarily by the self, of course, because I'm the one who communicates, but communicating to the other. Communication by definition, not only etymologically, because the whole idea of community, the whole idea of coming together, of having in common what is etymologically connected to the idea of communication, suggests the coming together of different people, of different individuals. But also, even commonsensically speaking, communication necessarily entails me being able to communicate with the other. Because language, I mean, if I were to talk only to myself, if I were to talk only about myself, to myself, within myself, if I were to stay within this bubble of self-sameness, as it were, I would not have probably required a structured language. I would have been able to somehow be able to express myself, to myself, about myself in modes that could have been otherwise than linguistic. Language is primarily required only when I want to exteriorize my thoughts and reach out to the other, to make myself understandable to the other, to be able to talk to the other, to be able to listen to the other. So language by definition is something that is always already other regarding, that is already always oriented towards the other, that is already always implicated in this possibility of inculcating alterity, in bringing about the other. So that goes without saying. So therefore, primarily what we, the audience that is gathered here, do or are presumed or supposed to do, which is to deal with language, is primarily an act of dealing with the other, of somehow taking into consideration the other. If we understand this, then maybe our task or what we are supposed to do becomes a little more understandable to us. That is, fundamentally, the project that we apparently are all engaged in is an ethical project, a project of being other regarding, of reaching out to the other, of dealing with the other. Now, this otherwise evidently very definitional concept of language becomes even more compounded when it comes to literature, for the simple reason that while in language also, I mean, in general language, in day-to-day language, in everyday phatic communion, if language is primarily oriented towards the other, then language cannot, as Saussure and others, and generally within linguistic theory has been elaborated upon, language cannot deal with only the centrality of self-same things. Language has to be differential in nature. Language, by virtue of being other regarding, by virtue of being oriented towards the other, has to necessarily always already communicate things that are otherwise than self-same. That goes true for all language, even emphatic communion, as I said. But in literature, and which is primarily what we deal with, because evidently in our discipline, we don't just deal with a language in its day-to-day forms of use, but primarily as literature, as literary text, it becomes compounded because literary texts by definition are supposed to communicate something more than the obvious, something more than the usual, something more than what a literal communication would entail or a literal communication would bring out. So this possibility of language being a medium, of always already reaching out to the other, rather than standing for what it is, what it in itself is, becomes all the more compounded when it comes to literature, because literature by definition has to deal with things which are otherwise than literal. It has to be more metaphorical. Our reading of literature has to definitely go beyond the obviousness of things and look at things that lie beyond that immediate surface level of denotative meanings. So especially when we deal with literary language, this possibility of language already taking us to the very doorstep of the other, to the doorstep of what is otherwise than what is self-samely meant, becomes all the more prominent and all the more pronounced, which makes therefore the task of us who deal with not only language, but more importantly, literary language, it becomes all the more ethically charged, therefore, because we are continuously dealing with not just one layer of othering, but almost a doubling of that othering, almost a doubly layered otherness, a doubly layered alterity that we have to continuously seek out. And this itself, the fact that doing literature, therefore, necessarily entails a negotiating with two layers of otherness, a reaching out to not only an obvious other, but probably to a not so obvious, probably a slightly more, let's say, what should we say, a hidden other, as it were, because if we talk about decoding literary meanings, this in itself, this doubled negotiation with the other is precisely what leads to, in a way, the two functions that literature and literary studies perform. And what are these two functions? This is something that we continuously talk about. On the one hand, literature is indeed about enjoyment. There is no doubt about the fact that ultimately the texts that we read, the cultural products that we deal with in our discipline, they are oriented towards enjoyment, they're oriented towards entertainment, they're supposed to provide us pleasure. And pleasure of the text is something that our discipline is extremely invested in, and that is fundamentally what we are supposed to deal with. Now, this pleasure itself, the pleasure of the text, as someone like Roland Barthes would have so succinctly explained, does not lie in us being able to decode the surface meaning of a text, because that does not require much decoding, and not much pleasure can be derived in but understanding the obvious. Rather, pleasure of the text comes to us. We derive pleasure from a particular text when we are able to almost unpack hidden meanings, when we are able to read between lines, when we are able to penetrate the surface plenitude of obvious meanings and look for and almost decode. It's an aha moment, as it were. Oh, so I have found something new, something that was hidden, something that was not obvious to the naked eye. But I, through my reading strategies, have been able to decode that. That is what really leads to the pleasure of the text, rather than a simple understanding of the placid surface of the text. The real pleasure of textual reading comes, therefore, from me being able to somehow access the other who lies, the other meaning, the other layers of hidden meaning that somehow lie probably under the shroud of so many layers of obvious meaning. So pleasure, if that be one of the functions of doing literature, of reading literature, of doing literary studies, that pleasure also comes if and only if I'm able to access the other. I'm able to access that which lies outside the scope of the obvious. And there is a second function also, as I said that literature and literary studies, as has been generally codified within the academic discipline of literary studies, has primarily had two functions. One is pleasure, as I said, and I have connected it also to the idea of the other. But the other function is that of criticality. Because not only are we supposed to, in the whole flow of enjoyment, which indeed is the primary function of literature, and therefore the primary goal of literary studies, but not only should we just kind of wallow in, kind of get carried by, so to say, carried away by the flow of what would be normative enjoyment, which in a way might stultify our creative and critical faculties and make us become more in consonance with the voice of normativity, where entertainment can be seen as packaged, almost codified in certain ways, which we are supposed to just participate in uncritically. But literary studies is also supposed to make us critical. It is also supposed to make us thinking human beings who can think through the modes in which normativity, the order of the day, tries to impose itself upon us. And this criticality can also emerge when we can think otherwise than what is normative. Because obviously the normative order of the day, what is supposed to be the given law of the times, that will require us to identify with what is presented as its surface mode, but only when we are ready to, only when we are invested in, only when we are committed to discovering the other that lies beneath the layers of this normative ordering, that we can be critical. We can be critical of the system that is only when we are committed to seeking out what is otherwise than normative. So once again, the key word becomes other. It's only when we realize that literature is indeed about seeking the other, only when we realize that the entire exercise of doing language studies and literary studies is indeed in being committed to seek out the other, reach the other, that we can be critical of the way things are, so that we can seek things that are otherwise than what is normatively enshrined in the current order of the day. So in terms of both the functions that literary studies are supposed to imbibe in us, be it this possibility of inculcating an entire hermeneutics of enjoyment, of pleasure, or be it the possibility of developing in us a skill towards criticality, a desire towards criticality. Both of these can also be possible if and only if we realize that language and literature are primarily oriented towards the other. It's in discovering the other within the literary process that we can serve both these functions, so to say, of literary studies in general. But herein start the ironies, the paradoxes therein. And where do the paradoxes lie? Because so far, so good. So far, we have discussed that language is indeed a means to communicate with the other. So language is always oriented towards the other. I'm just repeating what I've said. Furthermore, in literary use of language, it becomes doubly othered, because not only are you supposed to communicate with the other by using language, but you're supposed to communicate not in a facile, matter-of-fact manner, but in a more metaphorical manner, and therefore othering further the literality. And furthermore, where language and literature is therefore on both counts oriented towards the other, the function of literature and literary studies also gets fulfilled when you understand this other-drivenness of literature and language, because the two functions of doing literature, that of deriving pleasure and that of deriving criticality, both of them seem to be connected with precisely you being committed to discovering the other. So far, so good. The story could have ended here. But herein emerge the paradoxes of this entire process, which seem to point towards that in spite of this heavy investment, therefore, this definitional investment, therefore, in alterity, in the other, somehow language and literature also seem to enshrine, institutionally as it were, the self, the subject, which often seems to overpower, often seems to eclipse, often seems to loom large over this other regarding aspect of language and literature. And how so? So let us now enter into this paradox, therefore, this paradox of doing language, this paradox of doing literature, where the subject somehow gets enshrined all the time, and at the cost of even overpowering this basic ethical possibility of language and literature leading to the other, or leading us to the other. So where does this paradox emerge from? Now, clearly, and I will approach it from three sides as to how language also comes to enshrine the self, while language is oriented towards probably driving us towards the other. Now, the first perspective towards understanding this would be psychoanalytic. And since all of you are students and practitioners of literary studies, yeah, and since I'm talking extremely introductorily, and that too within the span of just a few minutes, just about 40, 45 minutes, I cannot go into greater details about this. But as you would know, as most of you would already know, be it Freudian psychoanalysis or be it Lacanian psychoanalysis, the kinds of psychoanalysis that have been contributive towards the literary theoretical project, which have been sufficiently engaged in the question of language, they seem to suggest that it is through language, it is through lingualization, it is through our introduction to language that the subject gets formed. Because clearly, in Lacanian terms, before the child acquires language, the child has still not acquired any kind of subjectivity. The child is not even an individual yet, not individuated enough yet, not socialized enough yet to be a subject. But with the acquisition of language comes the child's entry into the order of things, into the order of the day, into the law of the times, into the way things are. And therefore, language indeed becomes a means through which the individual who otherwise pre-linguistically was very dissipate, so to say, very dispersed, so to say, the individual at all takes the shape of a subject, the shape of subjectivity, only with the introduction of that person into the domain of language. So language, that was the first perspective that we must be aware of. So language becomes the very means through which the individual gets enshrined into subjectivity. So language, rather than being the only means, or rather than only being a means to usher us unto the other, paradoxically, language also becomes the means to make us into a subject. And that is, if we follow psychoanalytical literary theory or literary theoretical inputs from psychoanalysis. Similarly, and from a second perspective, and something that probably you are a little more familiar with, from a more Marxian perspective, from a more ideological perspective, and as Althusser has clearly pointed out, it is ideology, as you know, and ideology is a generic term for deployment of language through it being circulated in cultural, literary, religious, linguistic forms. So I'm using the word ideology very metonymically here to stand for language, because evidently Althusser or the Marxists in general do not particularly talk about language, but ideology is but a metonym for language. And as you know, since again, all of you are familiar with Althusser and Althusser's formulations regarding ideology, as Althusser succinctly says, ideology interpellates individuals as subjects. So again, in a way, the same psychoanalytical narrative that we were dispersed individuals, we get cast into some kind of a model subjectivity only through language. That kind of gets reinforced, albeit through the metonymical deployment of the generic term ideology rather than the specific term language. It in a way gets reinforced in Marxian attempts to deal with literature. And so simply put, as Althusser says, we could have been individuals otherwise than who we finally get projected to become. It is ideology, and in this particular case, I'm just replacing ideology with language, because as I said, language is but a part of ideology. It is language that steps in and calls us, hails us, and casts us precisely into subjectivity. So once again, so to put it simply, to put kind of the psychoanalytical angle and the Marxian angle together, simply put, I could have been someone else. I could have really done whatever I would have felt like. But the law of the times, the rules of the day, the order of the day, it steps in through language and getting me lingualized, getting me socialized, getting me kind of enter into the symbolic order of things. It interpellates me into a certain kind of subjectivity, a certain kind of project subjectivity with certain identity markers, that I am a male, that I'm an Indian,
that I am a Bengali, that I am whatever. I can keep on adding several identity markers to it. So all these identity markers get given to me or get thrust upon me, and I get cast in terms of these identity markers precisely through language. So what I become, the subject that I become, is but a product of language itself having stepped in and almost robbed me from what I could have been otherwise and cast me instead into some kind of a project subjectivity. So on both these counts, paradoxically, just like earlier we saw that language is the means to reach out to the other, language also becomes the means to enshrine the subject, to enshrine the self. And added to this and compounding things further is a third issue, since I said there are three lines on which I would discuss the paradox. And that is more sociological. And so not as philosophical or theoretical as my previous 2 points were, but more sociological. Incidentally, we can see that language often becomes a springboard of a lot of identitarianism, of a lot of even xenophobia, of hating the other, of creating modes of nationalism, linguistic nationalisms, linguistic sectarianisms. So all around us, we can see, I mean, of course, there have been, and we could, if we had that kind of time, we could have probably discussed at length the connection between language and nationalism and language and sectarian assertions. But suffice it to say, be it in our subcontinent or be it elsewhere, we have seen how language often becomes the means of a particular people almost congealing itself into some kind of an identitarian unit and asserting itself in terms of that linguistic nationalism, often against other languages, trying to impose itself as an hegemon over other languages at the cost of maybe marginal languages, minority languages being gobbled up by that subjectivity seeking, identity seeking, politically projected linguistic nationalism, or it in itself fighting against a hegemon in the name of linguistic nationalism, to as maybe the liberation of Bangladesh could be an example closer home, or let's say the Tamil struggle in Sri Lanka, albeit not really having gained the let's say the equivalent success, could be another example. I'm just deliberately giving examples from our own subcontinent, where language has become a means for a people congealing itself. I'm deliberately using the word congeal to give it some kind of a negative connotation rather than a positive connotation, to almost congeal itself into a collectivity and launching itself as an identitarian bloc with potential disregard for or struggle against or attempt to kind of almost gobble up or to resist, whatever it is, against other linguistic blocks. So on a third level, the sociological level, again, paradoxically, language, which at the beginning of my discussion, as I suggested, which could have been a means to seek out the other, a means to almost reach out to the other, beyond one's self-same cocoon, and to almost embrace the other, shake hands with the other, walk with the other, love the other, paradoxically becomes possibly the very launching pad for being able to orient oneself to often very xenophobic, often very sectarian, linguistic assertions. So language itself becomes a means of certain modes of project subjectivities, certain modes of carving out identities, linguistic identities in this particular case. So we are clearly face to face with a paradox. On the one hand, language and especially literature could have been or should have been a springboard to make us escape our self-same cocoons of selfishness and ethically reach out to the other. Because the mandate of language and literature is to be able to reach out to the other, to reach out to alterity. But paradoxically, language, and by extension literature also, is precisely also the very domain in which subjectivities and identities and self-samenesses get carved, get molded, get cast. So how do we deal with this paradox? How do we deal with the paradox? The same object of our study, namely language/literature, is on the one hand the very mold in which our subjectivities get cast, and often problematically so. And yet, it is the very means to break that mold and to reach out to the other. How do we resolve this paradox? How do we deal with this? Now, herein, to be able to understand this paradox, as also to understand probably the way out of this paradox, maybe a slight detour into a very slight detour into the mandate of humanities itself, because ultimately humanities is supposedly a discipline which is to be about the human subject and the human subject's achievements. And again, on the other hand, through cognate words like humane, humanitarian, and of course, more and more as we are moving into post-humanist times, when the whole idea of humanism, the idea of the human itself has started getting challenged and questioned. So humanities itself also becomes the very platform through which we are supposed to reach out, because of its humaneness, because of its humanitarianness, and because of its post-humanist possibilities, to the very other of that humanist subject. So if humanities itself almost shelters these two seemingly anti-parallel vectors, where on the one hand, it's supposed to be a cluster of subjects that is supposed to talk about the human subject, and on the other hand, it is supposed to talk about the human subject, but in terms that are humane in nature, in terms that are not sectarian in nature, in terms that are not anti-human, inhuman in nature, then maybe the entire panoply of sub-disciplines that come to comprise the field of humanities itself probably holds the key. And herein, some classic debates as to what the mandate of humanities is and where humanities has to walk, if at all it has to revive itself in days of crisis, may come handy. So when we talk about humanities, we see that the general debate about a certain crisis in humanities, that somehow the disciplines that we do, like literary studies itself or humanities in general, it has now been relegated to some sort of a second order discipline, to some sort of a lower discipline. This is not a new debate, and we find this quite early. More than 2 centuries back, Kant wrote a book, a very interesting treatise called Conflict of the Faculties. In different translations, it may be called differently: conflict of the faculties, contest of the faculties. That depends on which English translation you're following. But generally speaking, more than 2 centuries back, it was in 1798 to the best of my knowledge. I mean, anyone can Google and find out the dates. I think it's 1798. So more than 2 centuries back, Kant already wrote a treatise precisely reflecting on this second order, this second class citizenship that humanities and philosophy has been relegated to. And he says that the professional disciplines, and he names 3 professional disciplines of his times: medicine, theology, and law. Now, theology may not appear to be professional enough today. Maybe theology has been replaced nowadays by technology, because technology is almost a new religion of our times. But whatever it is, in Kant's time, medicine, theology, and law, these were the professional, vocational disciplines, which were oriented towards an immediate utile instrumental value. And therefore, as Kant noticed, these have become the higher faculties. In the university structure, in the university hierarchies, these 3 disciplines have been given and we are talking about 200 years back. So since these are employable disciplines, more students flock towards them, more government funding flows into it. As opposed to it, philosophy and humanities has been relegated to a lower disciplinary structure, to a lower disciplinary status. And this is what he primarily talks about in Conflicts of Faculties. And he has his own rather subversive solution to offer, but that is not particularly pertinent to our current discussion. But nevertheless, he says that it is precisely because, ironically, because humanities almost escapes the governmental control and surveillance that the more employable, instrumental, professional disciplines have, maybe we can just fly under the radar and we can do little things and no one will know, no one will get to know. That is Kant's suggestion as to how humanities can survive. this apparent relegation of it to a secondary status, to a second order, to a lower faculty status within the university apparatus. But as I said, Kant's solution is not of great relevance to our current discussion, but the distinction that he observes is very, very important. So on the one hand, there are the possibilities of an instrumentalization of a discipline which gets taught as a discipline which is instrumentally valid. That is, it can be used. It can be used in the here and now. It can be used right now as a tool, as a deployable tool, versus something, namely the humanities, that does not deliver unto you any transferable, usable skill that may not come to any use at this moment, in the here and now, but it apparently enhances your capacities of being a human, that apparently develops you, probably oriented towards a future to come, rather than the current times. Maybe you have no utility whatsoever as far as the current mode of being deployable in the here and now is concerned. But it has its value, probably subversive value, of enhancing you as a human being with thought that can lead you beyond the current here and now unto a to come maybe. Similarly, a century or so later, and this is almost a century later, not a century or so later, in 1872, Nietzsche also wrote a very interesting treatise. It's actually in the dialogical form, and it's a compilation of the first 5 lectures that Nietzsche delivered when he was first appointed as a professor of philosophy at the University of Basel. He was very young then, but whatever. These lectures have been compiled into a volume, and which is in some translations called Anti-Education, the Future of Our Educational Institutions. In some translations, the anti-education, the more polemical sounding anti-education phrase is dropped, and the volume is called On the Future of Our Educational Institutions. But whatever it is, so again, depending on which translation you follow, it can be called On the Future of Our Educational Institutions, or it may be called Anti-Education on the Future of Our Educational Institutions. But whatever it is, in these 5 lectures, Nietzsche also precisely goes into this particular dichotomy that has entered into education. On the one hand, he notices that there is increased focus now on the crafts, as it were. So which he calls in German Wissenschaften, which are transferable crafts, useful trades, so to say, as opposed to Bildung. And Bildung means growth, development. And again, so almost the same kind of Kantian dichotomy comes in, that somehow within educational apparatuses, we were talking about the crisis in humanities and trying to use that to resolve the paradox that we have. So it seems that the same crisis is being talked about. So somehow education itself has got splintered into, on the one hand, more deliverable, useful, instrumental, vocational skills, or subjects that try to deliver such skills, which are useful in the here and now, and which therefore necessarily often have a greater traction amongst both the students and maybe the officials who administer education. But on the other hand, there is probably relegated to a lower status, but on the other hand, is that kind of a discipline which deals with the subject still, but which rather almost drives the subject, almost almost suspends the subject from being tethered to the here and now, to the bondage of the here and now, to the bondage of instrumentality, unto a to come, unto what probably yet is not delivered, but it's always oriented towards a growth. Even Bildung, as you must understand, is always already in the present continuous. You're always growing. You've never reached the growth. You've never stagnated by having reached where the growth was driving you towards. So never being territorialized unto a deliverable horizon, but forever being driven beyond the horizon unto a to come. That seems to be precisely the way in which, and of course, debates about humanities go on through our century to throughout the 20th century, and I needn't go on any further about that because I'm keeping a close tab on the watch, and I must wind up in maybe around another 5 minutes or so if I'm to follow the 45 minutes that I've been allotted. And the debates keep on continuing throughout the 20th century, throughout our current times. But since the contours of the debate are the same, and in any case, I wanted to enter this debate about humanities primarily to be able to cull out a means to resolve the paradox that we have had between language being subjectivity driven as well as alterity driven, and how to resolve that. If my sole purpose in invoking this 2.5 century long debate is this, then it may suffice to have already said what I have said, and without unnecessarily dragging you through this debate any further. So as we have seen, so humanities, of which literary studies is but a part, it is indeed oriented towards the human being, because it's ultimately about the human being. And yet, rather than crystallizing itself and fossilizing itself in the state of the subject, in the state of the human being that I am today, that I am of use in this current society, humanities, and of which literary studies is but a part, it is about the human being, and yet already always oriented beyond the here and now unto a to come, unto a domain that is still not here, that is not now. It is already always differed. It is already always deferred. It already always kind of pushes us beyond the here and now unto that deferred and deferred possibility of the to come. And this is exactly where, and again, all of you are familiar, and I deliberately use a vocabulary that will ring a bell in every mind of the members of the audience seated here. This is exactly what Derrida tries to draw our attention to, that rather than the here and now, rather than the metaphysics of presences, present, the word present itself has two senses, as you know, the temporal sense and the spatial sense, because present as in present tense, present time, and present as in being present here. So both the sense of now and here get carried out in the word present. The metaphysics of presences, this almost tethering of ourselves, unto presences, where we are almost bound to presences, the here, the now. Everything that we do, everything that we learn has to be about the self-same cocoon of the here and the now, the hic et nunc, the presences. That itself is something that we have to contest. And once again, and Derrida particularly talks about writing, as you'd all know, but it may follow for other modes of linguistic communication which are recorded. Any mode of linguistic communication where somehow the uttered sound does not vanish the moment the here and now is gone. Of course, in pure phonic communication, like the current oral lecture that I am delivering in front of you, the moment this moment is over, the moment the here is gone, the moment the now is gone, the word that I spoke is gone. But evidently, this lecture is also being recorded. And that is what writing does, as you know, which records the fleeting spoken sound for a posterity. So even when you step out of the here and now, even when you step out of this moment, this space, this presence which ties us down, this presence which draws us into the cocoon of self-same subjectivities, even when you go beyond that, at a different place, at a deferred point of time, at another point of place, at another point of time, in the domain of the other, therefore, beyond the self-sameness of the presence of here and now, if there is recording, if there is writing, that particular discourse would still be available. So if what we followed from our brief discussion about the mandate of humanities, if us being redeemed from our captivity under the here and now, and us being ushered in unto the possibility of a forever to come, never really enshrined, never really actually fetishized and reified, but forever something that is to be different, that is to be deferred. If that is what the mandate of humanities is, then evidently writing itself and the literary process also precisely allows for that, where our communication, in spite of being somehow tethered to our subjectivity, is already always catapulted beyond the here and now unto that moment which is still to come, into that space which is still to come, in short, into the domain of the other. And therefore, literature and culture can, in spite of being about the self, still somehow always be pushed to that ethical project of the domain of the other. And needless to say, therefore, Derrida, in his elaborate theorization, particularly towards the late phase of his life, precisely focuses on this cosmopolitical bid that literature and language have to perform, and on issues like hospitality, on issues like precisely being ethically oriented into welcoming the other, into reaching out to the other, which precisely is, in a way, the mandate of language and literature. So to cut a long story short, and to, in a way, close my current discussion, because as I see, I am done with my time, and I must wrap up in a minute or so, so that there is some time for discussion and questions and answers, if any. So to wrap things up, language and literature, and I'm using the two interchangeably, are both, paradoxically, both a means to enshrine oneself, and which continuously gets articulated in several identitarian assertions, and needless to say, even in critical attempts to deal with literature, often we end up with doing identity politics of different sorts, because even our critiques, so to say, of ideological formulations within literary text may often happen from the standpoint of some kind of subjectivity, where we presume unto ourselves a certain kind of critical subjectivity and engage in ideology critique of a particular text and try to expose the ideological machinations of that particular text through the prism of that identitarian position. And indeed, therefore, language and literature is deeply bound to issues of subjectivity, to articulating one's subjectivity, to enshrining one's subjectivity, and even to assert maybe one's non-normative subjectivity, maybe even to embark on identity politics of different sorts, once again enshrining the self there. And paradoxically, on the other hand, language and literature by definition are also means of reaching out to the other, continuously escaping one's self-same cocoons and be able to view things otherwise than they are, otherwise than the here and the now. And this paradox is precisely what we, as students of literature and culture, have to continuously negotiate and continuously straddle and somehow be oriented in spite of the self-sameness that language, literature, culture always will try to tie us to, the utility-driven principles of us being bound to the here and now, that always principles we like to tether us to. In spite of that, we have to somehow cast away these chains and take off beyond the here and now to seek out that other regarding possibility of literature and culture, that alterity seeking possibility of language, to be able to therefore continuously, in the face of, and this I'm therefore more rhetorically repeating to close, to bring my talk to a close, especially in times like ours, when competitive fundamentalisms of different sorts are raising their ugly heads all over the world, when the whole world seems to be torn in different kinds of fundamentalisms, communalisms, sectarianisms, where self-samenesses and warring blocks of self-samenesses are now posing probably one of the gravest dangers that humanity has faced in several decades now. Especially in this context, what we need to understand is that language, while enshrining us in those very subjective constituents of who we are in terms of our religion, our language, our nationality, it also has the possibility of us being able to allo-identificatorily reach out to the other, go beyond those cocoons and somehow embrace the other, touch the other, and therefore in a way rend those chains of sectarianism that seem to be time ourselves all the more into our little identitarian fundamentalistic bubbles. And we owe this to literature and culture. And that would be my submission to this predominantly young group who are studying literature and culture today. Understand what you are doing. A lot stands on your tender shoulders, because you are the ones who would hold the future for us, and that future is also to come. It's not the here and now. It's your task to be able to take off on the discipline that you've chosen to study, to be able to seek out forever and uncompromisingly the other who's otherwise than who you are. And that really is where literature and culture would be able to possibly redeem us from these extremely difficult times that we are going through unto a possible future, a possible future that we can only wait and hope for. So thank you very much. And that is how language, subjectivity, and alterity can be connected together into a project that all of us ought to be committed to. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk and taking us through this very difficult terrain of the three subjects that you proposed to talk about today. And I mean, I've been thinking after listening to you how you've been able to connect such a vast area and even talk about the things that are relevant today and to the things that we might be facing as language students and literature students today. Um, Thank you so much for the enlightening talk. It's been so full of meaning that I think it will take some time for our students to process it and to come up with questions. I'm hoping that there will be questions. Arunab is going to deal with the question answer session. Okay, Arunab, over to you.
Thank you, sir. And Bhaduri, sir, it was a really informative lecture. I mean, language is truly the lifeblood of the social construct of humanity. So moving on is, I think the first question is from me. My question is that with the coming of modernism, we observe a certain mental blockage within the mind of the modern man, in which he cannot share his experience in the way he wants to. And as you said, it is the duty of language to provide pleasure to the reader. So my question to you is that in this pursuit of pleasure, language, which is supposed to be the medium of our experiences, being proved as increasingly useless, because as T.S. Eliot in his poem, The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock, uh, has said that it is impossible to say just what I mean, but as if a magic lantern patterns on a screen.
Then it would not have had that possibility of pleasure, which now it can have precisely because it is not so transparent. So when the poet, toiling with the inadequacy of language, still is able to express something in spite of the inadequacies and inexpressibilities, that pleasure of creativity is manifold than me just being able to say, well, there is a crow and the crow is flying, or some literal thing. Similarly, when the reader is able to penetrate several layers of incomprehensibilities and finally get that aha moment, that actually leads to greater pleasure than a simplistic literal understanding would have done. So rather than language having
failed, as you've said, in providing pleasure, it is precisely the failure of language that compounds pleasure and makes the literary act even more pleasurable. That is the contention that I have provided before you, and which also goes hand in hand in the general here and nowness versus the to comeness theory that I presented before you. If one were to exhaust meaning only in the here and now surface meaning, that is not really the objective of literary reading. Rather than the simple surface meaning, when we are guided to that which is not self-evident, that is where pleasure lies. So beyond the here and now, unto that to come. Maybe I don't understand the meaning of this poem currently. It will come, and I'll have to keep on driving my reliance of
participants in the meeting to ask their questions right now.
I see a hand raised, Madhusudan Tyagi.
Yes, Madhusudan Tyagi.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Uh, Good evening, sir. First of all, thank you for the very illuminating talk that you just gave, and it really, made me ponder over a lot of points that you presented in your presentation. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you, particularly, was you said that language, while it can, help us bridge the gap between, for example, the other, it can also simultaneously lead to these differences that are, ever present in the human nature, in the human experience. So how do you suggest we kind of bridge these two?
So that was precisely what my talk was about. So it is both. If it was only one of the two, it would have been so much simpler, but it's not. And language itself is the means through which we get cast into different modes of subjectivity, and language itself is the means through which we can reach out to the other. And the task of our discipline, as I said, is to be able to negotiate this paradox. And to be able to negotiate this paradox, as I also suggested, through the detour that I took, if we try to uncouple our discipline from instrumentality, from utility, from its immediate deployability into the here and now, and if we rather take our discipline as a springboard for doing a more ethico-political welcoming of better times to come, then we would have probably been able to successfully negotiate this particular paradox. So that has been what this entire talk has been about. Now, can I programmatically say that 1, 2, 3, 4, this is what you should do? So at 7 o'clock in the morning, you do this, at 9 o'clock, you do that, and then you would have negotiated this paradox. It can't be like that, because then it defeats the whole purpose of non-instrumentality. It's definitely a tortuous path, but then we, students of literature and culture, of language, of humanities, are precisely supposed to kind of take off on that tortuous path. There are no easy answers, but if you're committed to somehow making what we do and humanities as being the springboard for becoming more human beyond these inhumane times, and almost waiting for and paving the path for an ethical possibility to come, then maybe, however difficult or however unchartable programmatically that path may be, we may be in our praxis, in the way we teach, in the ways we learn, in the ways we do literature, maybe we'll be able to do that. That's my presumption.
Thank you, sir.
Excellent question, Madhusudan. Now let's move on. I guess there was another hand being raised. Who was that again?
Well, I think if there are no other questions at this time, I think that the students will take some time to process things. Um, it's actually been very, very powerful and a very, very informative lecture for them. Uh, they would
Can I?
really, yes, Poonam ma'am
Uh,
has some questions.
every now and then I'm reminded of this essay by George Steiner. I don't remember the exact title, but he's talking about, actually educating their gentlemen. And what they used to do was send them on a tour of Europe, uh, cultural hubs like Italy and Paris.
So your question, ma'am.
No, no, not
Right.
really. I just said that.
No, I get your point. What you're saying is that people from a particular culture would presume that for their gentlemen to have a humanistic education, they must be exposed to other cultures. And therefore, it was a practice of sending young Englishmen to continental Europe so that they got exposed to other cultures and learned from those cultures. Definitely. But I would not restrict our current humanities education to either gentlemen, and that to gentlemen of a particular class who would have the privilege of being sent abroad on. And I'm sure that in our current society also there are those year abroad students who can afford to take a year out and go on some little educational trip, but I would not restrict themselves to that privileged class alone, nor would I restrict their exposure to the other to only the privileged European sites of culture like France and Italy, because that all seems to be part of only a bigger subject. Rather than it really ushering in any encounter with the other, it is a gentleman's club, a privileged gentleman's club, going to what would pretty much be part of the same circuit. And rather than therefore really being exposed to the other, it would probably reinforce that very self-same white upper class male subjective sensibility. That so it was more of an act of reinforcement rather than really disturbing that subjectivity by exposing one to the other. So I absolutely agree with you that humanities education cannot happen without one being exposed to the other. But the other itself also has to be indeed otherly, rather than only a very restrictive, normative kind of a reinforcing kind of alterity. So a parallel would be that within our current schema of things, students of all genders, all races, all castes, all class backgrounds being exposed simultaneously, not to the highest, the presumably highest cultural locales of France and Italy, but to real sites of alterity. Maybe such field trips and all that can indeed probably open their horizons of thinking. But just gentlemen being sent to France and Italy will not probably serve the purpose. But of course, our students have to be exposed continuously to the other, and then and only can the mandate of humanities be served.
And I also remember, Oxford University did not really have a subject like humanities for probably centuries, some centuries. I don't know when it was introduced.
I'm not too sure about that. It definitely did not have English literature, but humanities itself, and which primarily would have driven through the trivium. As you'd know, when we talk about liberal arts, I'm slightly digressing. The idea of liberal arts, or what is artis liberalis, which means art or education for people worthy of liberty. When we talk about liberal arts today, the phrase liberal arts today, we presume that the arts are liberal. But that's not true. Etymologically, the old Greco-Roman discipline of liberal arts, because right from the Greek academies and the Roman academies, we have artis liberalis as a discipline, and which means art or education that is worthy of a person being free. So only those who have underwent a liberal arts education could become free citizens. But whatever, that was not the point. The point was that right from at least the maybe 4th century AD or so, and someone can Google out the exact coordinates a little better. We have these 7 liberal arts, pretty much part of the curriculum, and which were divided into these 2 groups, quadrivium and trivium. The quadrivium means four subjects, and which included the exact sciences. So geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music. Music was also considered to be an exact science because it really required exact notations and all that. So the quadrivium and the trivium, incidentally and ironically, the word trivial has come from the word trivium. So rhetoric, grammar, and logic. These 3 were considered, well, the consideration came later, the trivial, but that etymologically, these belong to the trivium. So the quadrivium and the trivium together became the 7 liberal arts, and that has been part, unbroken. And even in Oxford, therefore, the part, the curricular backbone of what was liberal education. And I'm not aware of any era wherein Oxford, what we today understand as humanities, which is the trivium, basically. That is why I took you on this long detour. The trivial part, the
maybe I was
liberal
wrong.
arts, that was so rhetoric, grammar, and logic. These 3 were always part of Oxford's curriculum, albeit from the late 18th century onwards and throughout the 19th century, as Kant and Nietzsche pointed out in the German context, it must have got undervalued vis-a-vis the quadrivium. And the quadrivium and the other more employable disciplines might have taken the upper hand, but I'm not aware of any era when Oxford would not have had any humanities. But if you're talking about English literature, certainly Oxford did not have English literature till very recently. I see another long question. Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
Moshina.
thank you for correcting.
Can I ask a question? I don't know whether there's nobody in the queue. Am I jumping the queue?
There is a question
Am
typed
I jumping
in the
the queue? I can wait.
Yeah, there is a question typed in the chat box, but
Okay, so let that go first. Yeah, then I'll go ahead.
well,
Let it go first.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, it says, your talk has been enlightening as always. It is always a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much. My question is, rather than language being relegated to simply a tool of utility in understanding the self or the other, to what extent would you say that language is subjectivity or language is alterity? Could we divorce language from either subjectivity or alterity? If not, how is language a mere instrument and not ingrained in the very thing itself? I deviate from the definition of language in terms of literariness. I'm also referring to language as a very process of thinking, even proto-language and body language for that. But that's an excellent question. I mean, of course, I may have got misunderstood into it being presumed that I was talking about language as a tool to either inculcate the subject or to reach out the other. You're absolutely right in stating that language is the very substratum, because that is the crux of your question, that rather than language being a mere tool of either this or that, of either enshrining one's subjectivity or ethically propelling one to the other, why must language be seen as a tool? Why can language be not seen as a thing itself, as a substratum itself of constituting one's subjectivity and constituting alterity? Well, that is probably the point that I made, but if it has appeared, in spite of my my rather strong anti-instrumental rhetoric, if it has appeared to you that somehow I talked about language as being a tool, I apologize for it. That was not my intention at all, because language is not a tool. Language is the very matrix in which we are hung. And it is that very substratum in which our subjectivity, not through which, but in which is the crux of your question, our subjectivity as well as alterity get continuously done and undone and redone. So I thank you for your question, and I couldn't agree more with it. And I apologize if somehow my talk has made any members of the audience feel that I was ascribing an instrumental role unto language, because that would be quite a travesty of the thrust, very non-instrumental thrust of my talk. Language is the very substratum in which things work out, rather than the mere tool through which subjectivity and alterity is engendered. So thank you very much, Meenakshi Sharma, for this wonderful question. Yes, Moshina?
Can I be heard? Like, I don't. Okay.
Yes, clearly.
Yes. So when we look at this idea of differ and defer, when from here and now to come, it almost like a continuum, continuum which we work on, be it in terms of pleasure or be it in terms of meaning or whatever we want to achieve or whatever we want to feel about literature. I was in that case, it is difficult to trace what we call the paradigm shifts that we can see sometimes. So I just wanted to ask, like, how when we look at this idea of man itself as a subject, and also the one who is operating language, he himself emerges at a certain time of history where he is not a subject to so-called God made and the words of God or the master has me asked me to say this. He also emerges historically at a certain point of time. So when we look at the continuum of here and now to come, uh, how for us as critiques of literature or maybe a student of literature, how easy or difficult it is to actually trace paradigm shifts, because then there is
Right.
it's almost like pinpointing somewhere, defining the context, and like almost like placing it somewhere. So
Right.
I don't know whether
Yeah. Right. So the process is continuous. The weight is continuous because it is inexhaustible, it is irreducible. But the destinations that you arrive at in the process of that continuously going ahead is not necessarily continuous. Just like, just to give you an analogy, maybe a journey that you embark on, maybe a continuous journey, you're indeed on a journey, but the discrete stations that come on your way, which one of which you could get off on, get off at, the other you can choose to leave, they could be very different in terms of their characters. The individual stations that come on your way, they could be very discontinuous. They could belong to different provinces. They could belong to different kinds of people. I mean, anyway, let's not drag this railway analogy very far. But to go back to what I was saying, so what is continuous is this never exhausted desire in you to not get caught up in any one set of here and now and to still push the envelope, to keep on going. That pursuit is continuous, but the destinations that you cross on that pursuit, on the route of that pursuit, they are not continuous. So paradigm shifts are pretty much possible to conceive within the conception of a journey that, however, is irreducible. So I don't find any disconnect between the two. So, and it's absolutely essential, as you've said, to continuously think of paradigm shifts rather than thinking of one never-ending, always continuous, unchanging flow of humanity. So this is how one has to think of it. So one has to continuously push oneself beyond whatever the self has become at that point of time. That push is continuous. But while you push, the different levels that you may arrive at, the different levels that you may have to cross, the different barriers that you have to still keep on pushing, those barriers may be very discontinuous, very different, continuously evolving and continuously shifting in terms of their paradigms. Yeah. So the continuousness of pushing does not entail the continuity of what you push.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see another hand, Muhammad Akil.
Kindly unmute yourself, Mr. Akil.
Okay, maybe he cannot
Mr.
hear us, or
Akil?
maybe he raised the hand by mistake. That's also possible.
Well, are there any questions from the participants? If there is, then kindly ask now. Well, I don't think there are any more questions.
I think, yeah, that's.
I think we
don't
should
have.
move on to the.
Yeah. Thank you, Arnav. I'll take over from here.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir, for the question answer session as well. I guess we have come to the end of the session. I would request Manjari to offer the vote of thanks.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say it was a wonderful session, Professor Bhaduri. And let me quickly wrap this up, the final vote of thanks. So, on behalf of the English Literary Society, the Department of English, Zakir Hussain Delhi College Evening, I extend my thanks and a lot of gratitude to Professor Saugata Bhaduri for taking his time out of his busy schedule for the lecture today. We have all come out of the lecture wiser than we were. It has been tremendous learning experience for all of us. I thank our principal, Professor Masroor Ahmed Beg, for always being a pillar of support and source of encouragement in all the activities that we do as a department. I thank our department teachers and the teachers of other departments of the college for guiding us to make the event a success. Last but not the least, I would like to thank our audience and teachers and students across the colleges and universities for being wonderful listeners. Thank you all. It was really a great session, and we got to learn a lot from Professor Bhaduri.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was mine.
Thank you.
And I wish all of you all the very best. And we'll definitely meet again some other time. Thank you
Thank you,
very
sir.
much.
Thank you.
Just a moment, Professor Bhaduri. There's one photograph that we'd like to click with you, the whole faculty together. Madhumita, please do meet.
Yeah, I'll do it. Sorry, since I'm in college and there are hundreds of other things happening alongside with timetable and exams and everything. So I have not been as attentive as I would have wished to have been. That is the admission that I'm making. But if everybody could turn on their camera so that we could click some photographs, which we need for all the documentation purposes these days.
Everybody, as in all the students too?
Students and faculty, everybody present in the meeting. There now are still around 60 plus people who are still here.
And you also have to make the display mode such that all the thumbnails are
Yeah. So I've done that. So right now there are 5, 10, 20, 25 in one. So they're coming in 3 pages. So anyway, so I'll just start. So second page, I can only not see everybody is switched off. Very few people are turning on their cameras, never mind.
I think it's okay. I mean, don't.
I'm not forcing the students. Could I request all the faculty members the students, please turn off your cameras, and all the faculty members, please turn on your cameras. All students, please turn off your cameras. Yeah, Anas is here, Nahid, Mimosina, Minakshi, Tejaswini, Poonam.
Poonam was here a while ago.
Yeah. I know Hari is busy in something in college, so.
It's okay, I guess, rather than.
Yeah, so anyway. Okay. Thank you so much, Bhadurida, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Take care. I'll take your leave.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much, sir.
We'll end the meeting.
Yes. Bye.
Yeah, I guess. Thank you.